All right, we're back, and now I have sound. It's bizarre. Okay, it's COMP123, summer 2016. At Centennial, we're doing programming 2, which is C#. Um, Last time we left off, we just did this, fixed up our form. Let's take a look at our form. So where we left off was this place here, and I'll put it up on GitHub as well, where we have our student list form looks a little nicer now. We got a little bit of a problem here. But I want to talk about, before we go into this is just semantics again. This is just, how it looks. And again, you can, on any data grid form, you can do one of these, right? Here's something else. What if I click up here? Will this crash? Can I crash a code somewhere? And the thing is, I can, right? Remember I talked about this? It says, if I go beyond the value and I want to go to the next form, I can click somewhere. Let's run this thing again. If I go to stop, even if it doesn't show my numbers, here's another thing that's a problem. If I click anywhere in here, right, anywhere in here whatsoever, right, if I click here, right, like down in here, is there a way I can crash my form out without, is there some way of doing that? And I'm just trying to click on anywhere. See that? That's what I just did. So I want to, this is what I'm going to do to you guys. I'm not going to do it on purpose, but I'm saying what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and see if there's anything that crashes your forms out. Now, what crashed my form? Let's watch that again. So again, up here. If I try and do this, right, double click or single click, or how about if I highlight and I double click or single click up here, does that do it? Well, that's weird. Look at this. That should never happen, right? Well, that's new student. Well, how did I do that? Look. And now it's just doing this all the time. It's somehow I'm able to come back there. Yeah, because I've tried to break it. Okay. So how do you troubleshoot something like this? Before we go to EF framework, right? Because we want to make this form as good as possible. Well, one thing is, remember what I'm doing, right? So I have this cell content click, and I'm just doing it, right? Which is wrong. I shouldn't just be doing it. I shouldn't just allow any content to be clicked. I should be focusing on just the columns 4, 5, and 6. Just columns 4, 5, and 6. I shouldn't care about the header column, so it can't be -1 or whatever. So my row can't be -1. It can't be the column header, and it can't be, my column index has to be greater than 3. That's what I have to do. So how do I do that? Well, I want to put this all, just as a check. This is a quick one to do. If my header row is not clicked, as an example, that's 1. If header row is not clicked, and details, edit, or delete columns are clicked. So one of those two things. It's got to be one of those or my row header not being clicked. Well, the way to do your row is if my row index is not equal to -1, right? Row index -1 means it's my header row. That's what it means. So if I go if E, which is my argument, right? Or my dot row index, right, is not equal to -1. That's what I want to do first. That's the first part, the first check. And at the same time, I want both these conditions to be true. My column index, right, is greater than 3. Then and only then do I want to be able to do the rest of this stuff. I want to be able to go to the next page. Otherwise, I don't want it ever to happen. Because if I can click on something that can make me go, right, to the other page, it's going to come up with some weird results, like an empty page or whatever. This is the only time that I want to be able to do that, right? So I want to check to see if this is true, and if it's true, then I can protect myself from that ever happening. Let's check this out. Again, this is another bit of troubleshooting we're doing with my form. I know I'm going crazy with the troubleshooting, but because, this is what happens. Okay, so if I click down here, double click, if I click in here, I double click in here, double click up here, come up here. If I highlight everything, oops, go back. If I highlight everything and I double click something, I double click up here. How about over here on the form down here? I want to try and click as many places as I can without clicking a button. Because obviously I know that the Add Student button is going to take me to Add Student. I know that. And I know that the details button is going to take me to details. I got to check all this. And my edit button is going to ask me to edit. Oh, that's good. And my delete button is going to ask me to delete. These are all working now. So you see that I was able to take care of that problem so that I can't give myself some weird thing by just doing an if statement. If it's the right columns and rows, we're good to go. So far my form is pretty much rock solid. Well, not really. We'll talk about that later on, not today. For example, I'm not really checking to see what the details are. And in my database doesn't really care what kind of data is going to be entered in. What if I entered more than 50 characters, right? That'll crash my database. It'll say, if you're trying to enter data that doesn't so I'm only saying my column total for my full name, my first name and last name for my student can only be 50 characters. But if I put as many characters as I want, for whatever reason, it'll crash, right? And the same thing with my number. If I try and put more numbers than I can fit, right, as an example, it'll crash too. So there's other things we can do to stop to check with. And I did this on purpose when I was designing this thing, because I wanted to check this out. But what I want to do is I want to talk about something called the entity framework for the second half of today, right? So if I was going to look up what the entity framework is, so I go entity framework, not a C# tutorial, but let's say entity framework. What is that? Like it says here, it's an object relational mapper, right? That basically allows us to use almost like access data as if it's, as an example, get entity framework. This is kind of the old documentation. I want to see this if I can make this work. Yeah. What it does actually is it gives us a few things, and I don't have the details for you, but I will put up a little PowerPoint later on this week for entity framework. One of the things that the entity framework does, it gives us 3 approaches to getting data from the database, all right, to formulating our data. There is something called a database first approach, which is most often used. The database first approach says, okay, let's read the data that's in the database, okay? And from the database, let's create our model, our class. It actually automatically generates it for you. So it looks at the database, says, what is this table I'm reading? Oh, it has an AD, it has the student number, all this kind of stuff. Take that data from the database, make a model from it. That's the database first approach. And what it does is it actually creates a diagram of what the database looks like and all this kind of stuff. That's number 1. Second way, model first approach. We draw the model, like physically draw it, and then from there we generate our code and the database gets generated right away from the model. We just draw a picture and the database gets generated with some dummy data. Oh yes. And the third way, which is what we're going to do today, actually the third way is if we don't have any data in the database, right? And I have my model first, I define my model. Here's my class, right? I don't draw my model, I'm just making a class, and from my code, it generates the database from my code. That's the code first approach. So there's 3 different approaches for entity framework, really as a quick rundown. The database first approach, the model first approach, where you actually draw the model, right? And the code first approach. Right? Code first approach meaning we have our code and then we make the database from our code. Okay, how do we do this in Visual Studio? First of all, we have to go back to my Solution Explorer. And we made lots of changes. You know, I have to say, we made lots and lots of changes to our stuff. Let's put everything up on GitHub, because I've made everything work. I kind of did some troubleshooting and I made some changes. These are all the changes I made to the forms. So I'll say updated forms with some user experience troubleshooting. So basically all I've done is kind of check to see if the user experience is pretty good. Yes, somewhat it is. I think we're good to move forward. I'm going to click sync, and then I'm going to click push. So I've just pushed everything to the database. So now, or to GitHub. So you have everything on GitHub for what I've just done, all my changes. Some of it is, here's a funny thing with GitHub. When we do UI with GitHub, one of the things you get is you get all my code for GitHub, but you can't really see the UI. You have to download my code, set up a dummy database with the exact same way of doing stuff. And this is a problem, right? The problem is because you may not have my database. Right, so what happens? How do you get my database? And unless you have a connection string, you have to kind of recreate the database from the connection string. It's some difficult.
You can just always create your own.
You can make your own database and stuff like this, but you have to kind of match it up with my connection string and all that. Or make your own. Switch out the connection string that I give you with your own. That's the other way to do it. Okay, so that's one. Now what I want to do is I want to add a models folder. This is the entity framework approach. Okay, we're going to talk about entity framework today, and again, with a little bit of a lab that I'll give you next day, you're going to do a little bit of your own table and create your own model and so on. Okay, so I'm going to right click here, and I'm going to go add new folder. This is new, and we're going to call this the models folder. By the way, if I can actually type properly, my gosh, rename models. Okay, so when you learn about the entity framework, if you do in the future, if you do COMP123 with me, and we do a real database with entity framework, whatever I do here will be absolutely transferable to the web. 100%. What I do here today, you'll be able to do almost everything identically that we did with Windows Forms on web forms. Okay, almost identical. So first we create a models folder. Next, I want to create a new model that looks like code, right? I'm going to use the database first approach because we already have a database, right, with a student table. That's what we have. But there's an extra setting, and I want to show you this thing. So I'm going to right click on models, and I'm going to click add, and I'm going to go new item, and this is new. We have to delete some stuff after this too. I'm going to click on data, and under here you see that there is something called ADO.NET Entity Data Model. This is the entity framework, what I'm accessing here. So when I go ADO.NET Entity Data Model, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a context, my own custom context. And when I say context, it's almost like, what's my connection to the database? Remember, context is all about connection to the database, right? So I want to call this something that makes sense. And remember, I already have a context called student data context, but I don't want to use that. That's the other way. That's the old way of using ADO.NET with link. I don't want that. I want to use link with entity framework, which is slightly different. Very similar, but you're going to see the differences in a second. We can use our database tables as lists, which gives us more power as an example, and we understand lists a lot better than that other weird syntax we saw earlier. Because that weird syntax, like db.getTable, and inside the type of student, and then that was really weird. And that's kind of the older way of doing it. We want to do it simpler, and ADO.NET, the entity data model, allows us to do that. So we're going to change this name down here from model. We're going to call it student context. That's what we're going to call this thing. So the student context is what we're doing down here. That's our model. Then we're going to click add. Okay, it's going to ask us, hey, you're using entity framework. Which approach do you want to use? Do you want to look at the database and pull this down? Normally, the old way, the deprecated way, right, is doing it this way, using AEF Designer from database. Yeah, but then we're going to get like this design, and it's going to lock us into using it this way. This is a valid approach, right? But I don't want to use this right now. This is the old way we don't want to use. This one, empty EF Designer model, doesn't make any sense. That means we're making a model, like a drawing of what the data looks like, but we don't have one of those, right? And I'm not going to make a drawing and go to my database because I already have a database. This doesn't make any sense. Empty code first model means we don't have a database and we're going to use the code and we're going to generate the database, but we already have a database, so that's not it. So the last one is the one we want to use, code first from database, where I take the data from the database, analyze it, and create a model in code that I can look at. This is the one I want to use. And click next. Okay, it says, hey, what kind of connection string do you want to use? Well, I already have a connection string, right? My COMP123, whatever connection string it was saying, the old settings. All I want to do down here where it says student context, I want to change this to say student connection. So make this student connection, please. And then click next. Now it's going to ask you for the tables. I want to basically target my students tables. If you had more than one, you'd kind of select all the tables you want to include in this connection, right? And then I'm going to click finish. What this is going to do is going to go up to the database, take a look at my tables, analyze them, and create a class based on the table data that it finds. Let's take a look. It's going to take a moment for it to generate everything because it's in generator mode right now. Oh, well, there it is. It's going to take two things. Let me take a look at what it does. First of all, it added the entity framework reference to my project. Next, I'm going to close this up for a second. Under the models folder, it added two models, right? It added the student.cs class, which is cool. I like this one, right? And it also added my student context, which is my connection to the database. So what I want to do to use entity framework is I want to get rid of my student.dbml, which is the database to SQL bridge, my link to SQL bridge. I want to get rid of that because I don't want to use that method. I want to use entity framework, right? So we're going to right click on this student.dbml that we had from last day, right? And delete it. And now, if you notice, I have my two models, my student model and my student context, and I want to replace all instances of student data context with student context. Let's take a look at that. So I'm going to go back to, and I need to do this properly, so I want to go back to my, my two forms, and I want to start looking at my student list form first and see if there's anything in there. So here's my student list form. I want to see the code, and I want to see if there's any references, and yes, there are. Take a look. Here's my student data context. It's not student data context anymore, it's student context. So I just need to take away just modify this to say student context. Cool, student context. That's the one I want, right? Okay, cool. And that's really weird. It's a student list type of student. I'm getting an error there. And I got to fix that one up for in a second, all right? And the reason why it's giving me this, student context and student, is because, and it doesn't know it, is because all this reference to student context and student is inside my models folder, which means I have to make a reference to my models folder up here. So I'm going to say something like this, COMP123. How about I make a using statement? Using COMP123 dot models. Once I've done that, it's going to add the models, a reference to the models into my folder. So I replaced student context or student data context with student, and that's it. So far, so good. Not many changes on my student list because I only read it one time. So there's not a lot of changes going on there. Next, let's read the other one. So now I'm going to look at my student details form. This, I have a lot of errors already. Let me take a look because remember, I'm using entity framework now. All right, first let's do the same thing. Let's say using, right, COMP123 dot models because I want to include the data model, the models folder inside of my class. Okay, here, this is wrong. Student data context can't be right anymore. I got to get rid of that because there is no more student data context. It's just student context. I'm using entity framework. Okay. Uh-oh. These are all wrong. This is what I was talking about before. This is kind of weird. It doesn't read properly. When we first did this, you're like, okay, Tom, where did you get this? Where did you get db.getTableStudent? That doesn't make any sense at all, right? Wouldn't it be better if we just said the same thing? db.students.add, which is, you know, the way we would do it with some kind of list. And that's what we do. We replace db.getTableStudent with db, right, .students .add, and then we pass in new student. So this little line replaces this, which makes more sense. So add a new student to the students table. That's what it's saying. Let's get rid of this. And let's do the same thing down here. Instead of delete, right, what would be how do we get rid of stuff from a remove, right? That's the way we do it. So same thing. So we say db.students.remove, and we put in new student. That's the beauty of using entity framework. We know and love these commands. It makes more sense. It shortens the code, and it gives us more power. I'm going to show you what it does. Now here's a problem. db.submitChanges doesn't exist anymore, and the new one that works with entity framework is db.SaveChanges. It's very similar. Right? So we do those. These are all the changes we have to make for entity framework to get it up and running. All right, okay, we're still not done. Let's keep going. Okay, again, student data context, not student data context anymore, student context. I just called it that, right? You can call it whatever you like, by the way. All right, cool. And darn, that's it. That's it. And after this, if we were for write, first of all, we'll build everything. We're going to click build to make sure that it's correct. And if everything goes well, right, now we're using Entity Framework, which is the most common, most popular framework out there for .NET technologies. The most modern one that uses LINQ for querying data, right? And a list-like syntax for referring to tables, which is perfect. It's beautiful. Let's take a look. And there's something else it does that gives us as well, which I want to show you. And if everything works, this kind of comes up and there's no errors, which it doesn't. It comes up with no errors. We're golden, people. So if I go here, I can look at the data. I'm still reading the data the same exact way, but I don't need that link to SQL connector anymore. That link to SQL bridge is gone. I'm using Entity Framework. That's my bridge. And again, it's a wrapper. It's an object relational mapper, right? That's what it is, if you will, an ORM for SQL data or any kind of other database. I don't have to use it just for SQL database. I can use Entity Framework with other types of databases. For example, MySQL, or if I wanted to use it with something else, right? It's very, very flexible. Whereas the link to SQL bridge, I can do SQL, but that's it. If I wanted to use some other kind of database, I'd have to get another kind of driver for that. And that's a real pain, right? That means I have to get a different driver for every kind of database. Here, one driver connects to any database I want, right? With the same syntax, which is in the syntax that we know. All right, let me go back. And let's check this out. What else do we get? So we get this. These are the changes we made. So far we're good. We've adopted LINQ and Entity Framework. Let's take a look at my student model. So under models, under my models folder now, I have another class called student. Well, now we can actually look at the student class and see what it looks like, which makes sense. Take a look. I got my student ID. This is generated right from the database. Here's my student ID. And then required, I got these little kind of filters going on. That's what these things are, almost like attributes. And my string length of 50. Well, what is this doing? What this is doing for me is saying the following. It's saying, hey, I have a first name field from the database that I've read from the database, and it has a string length of 50. Take a look. These are all the things they can do. This is a nice representation of the table. This model represents the table data and the way it's set out in the table. If I wanted to do another model, right, another table, it would turn out just like this one, right? So I have an actual class-based representation, right, of what my student would look like. This is it right here. So my student class has these properties, and that's how I can access them now. They're right here. They're exposed to me, not like how it was before where they were hidden inside of another context. They're right here and they're exposed to me, which is beautiful. Okay. Also, it also generates something called student context, which is just a reference to my database connection. So if I double click on this, you can see that I got my student context, which is this is my constructor, and my constructor calls the base class, the DB context constructor, with the name of my connection string, student connection. And then what it does is it says, hey, create a DB set, just like we did this data set down here. This is my data set right here, right? In fact, I'm almost ready to get rid of my data set altogether because I don't need to use it anymore. Yes?
Can you see the connection string under this framework, or it is hidden?
Which one?
If you use the framework,
yes.
Is there any connection string?
Yes. The connection string is in always for this one is in app config for Windows Forms, right? And web.config for web forms, or MVC. If you're using MVC framework, it's under web.config. And here's the configuration, the connection string. Notice now I have two connections, right? Let me point this out to you so you know, right? One connection is this one right here, which points to my original connection that I used to connect to the database, right? For my DB set that I made, right? And here's the other connection, my student connection, that I just made that connects directly to my database using Entity Framework. I don't need both. I don't need both. And where am I using right now, just asking you, And I'll end it like this for you guys today, because this is all I want to show you. Then we'll go into more detail next day, right? But where do I actually physically use this connection? If I go to my tables, let me just go look here for a second. And I want you to tell me if it's possible that I can delete this. Here's my student details form, right? I don't use it here at all. The connection doesn't happen here. I don't use my old data set type connections here. See, this is my old data set type. My COMP123 dataset.xsd. That's my old way of connecting to the database. I'm not connecting to it anymore like that, right? I don't need to use this anymore. So I want to get rid of it. Well, the only place that it's being listed is right here, down in here. This is where it's using the database. So if I look at this, and if I kind of was going to go here, if I actually click on this and this little smart arrow, if you notice it says I'm using this student binding source. That's what I'm using, right? Now there are other sources, other data sources that I can use. If I click down in here, you can see that I have other binding sources, like project data binding sources. So I could use this data set that we had used before, which gives me students. I could also use student list form, my list instances. I can use this one too, which also uses data, right? And I have two. I have data binding source and data binding source 1. How about if I didn't use a binding source at all? Would this mess me up? Hell yeah. Let me tell you why. Just putting it out there for you guys. Unless I choose to do programmatic data grid view, right? I have to, or connect somehow, you know, to this. My first name, last name, and number, and my student ID doesn't know where to get that data from. I have to create bound fields manually inside of the data table myself. This takes a little bit of extra work. That's why I'm not doing it today, right? And I'm connecting to the database manually this way, right? As opposed to automatically through choosing a data source. This way I can get rid of the references down here, and I can also get rid of this COMP123 dataset.xsd, which finally frees me completely freedom from the old ADO.NET data, access to access the data table, right? We need a couple more things to do to free ourselves of that situation, right? Because if I was to take them away right now, and I could, you're going to get your first name, last name, and number 0. There's not going to be anything in those columns because it doesn't know what to do with it. So I'm going to leave you with this note. We still need to fix things. It's operational right now. It is first physically operational. We're getting data, right, into our data grid view. But we need to do a little bit more work in order for it to be completely 100% compatible with Entity Framework. By the way, these things I'm doing don't clash. So if you left it this way, worst case scenario, right? It's not going to hurt you. It's just not as efficient. That's all. Questions around Entity data and Entity Framework. Entity Framework again is an a wrapper, right? A wrapper that goes around, the data that we're going to get, and we use list syntax. I want you to think of this. I'm trying to break it down as easy terms as possible. List syntax to access the data in the tables, right? Just like we're used to, the add, remove, that kind of stuff, right? We can also iterate through the list with a for each loop, no problem, just like we're iterating through any other list, right? If you really want to. Because once we have it as a list, and I get the data from the database, it's a list. I can do with it whatever I want, just like as if it's a list, right? We already know how to do CRUD because all I've done is made some minor changes. And the idea behind CRUD is, to finish off, when we do an update, we take the data that's already in the text boxes and assign them to a new object that's related to the data table. In our case, it's a student object, right? And then we update or save changes to the table. So this is a new object, let's save the changes. When we delete, we're going to go and do the remove. When we're going to add, we're looking at the add method. It's pretty straightforward, right? Whereas before, it was quite detailed, and you have to have that other syntax, db.getTable, student, and then blah, 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 right? Questions around this so far? We're going to do more of this on Friday. Please be prepared for a lab that'll be due the Monday. Okay, that's 100% going to happen for the Friday. Guys, thank you so much. I'll see you Friday.
What is ADU? Why is it ADU?
We'll talk about it in a second. Hold on a second. Let me finish